afterwards?
I hope there'll be a discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
So there will be questions.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
Yeah, no.
We are very blessed to have with us our Merrow Fellow, who is staying at Virginia Seminary, and she will be doing a presentation about abortion, which is one of the topics that will be discussed at some point in our courageous conversations. So over to you, Emma. And there will be time for questions at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm kind of going to shorten a paper that I gave the other week at VTS. So because I really do want to make time for questions and conversation. As we all know, the topic of abortion is deeply emotional and deeply divisive. I myself have been really kind of trying to wrestle myself with kind of my strong feminist kind of feelings, which give me one kind of understanding, and trying to work out how I think theologically about this. And so what I'm going to offer you today is where my thinking has got to, and I hope that that will then allow us to have some questions and conversations. But the thing I want to say, I think really strongly, is that as Christians we need to know how to have nuanced conversations and pastoral conversations around this topic, and find ways of being brave enough to speak, oh my word, that's the effect I'm having, find ways to speak into the difficult divide. The psalmist says, "For it was you who formed me in my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb." And I think that there are two things that I want to take importantly from that verse. The first is the sense that something in the womb is being formed. It is in process. And secondly, that it is being formed within a mother's womb. And this is something that we need to always remember, that although we can, through science these days, actually create an embryo outside of the womb, we cannot bring an embryo from that stage into a time where it can be born and become a human being, except through the body of a woman. And this early stage of pregnancy is actually open to failure, as many women know. We have no idea how many eggs that are fertilized actually are lost very, very early in kind of, a late period, which is either greeted with kind of relief or distress or something in the middle. We also know, very sadly, that 1 in 4 or 5 pregnancies end in the first 10 or 12 weeks of pregnancy. I myself have had 3 pregnancies. The first one and the third one have produced the 2 wonderful young men who are my sons, but the one in the middle ended at 10 weeks in what was called a missed miscarriage, or what my notes called a spontaneous abortion. And that was the technical medical term for it. So how do we talk about the complexity of the life that is developing in the womb, the sadness and the tragedy that people feel about spontaneous abortions, early pregnancy loss, and the fact that people want to be able to be acknowledged as having lost a baby at that stage, whilst at the same time allowing the fact that some people want to end an early pregnancy and want to have an induced abortion. So there's a few points I want to make at the beginning, and then I hope we'll be able to talk about it. First of all, we need to challenge the sense that we can talk about 2 competing rights, that actually we can say that there is the right of the unborn child and the right of the mother, as if we are talking about concepts of human rights in the way that we talk about them when we talk about things between two people. Because it's not an equivalence. However we want to think about it, we cannot understand the life that is developing in the womb as a separate person. A very good writer, Margaret Kamitsuko, writes, "The fetus is an unavoidably developmental uterine being who evolves incrementally towards born personhood. It can only exist connected, contingently and contiguously to the maternal body." And she says, a kind of gloriously ambiguous, very Anglican kind of statement. She says, the fetus is not a person, and the fetus is not a non-person. And that's the very complicated paradox, that we're dealing with something that is precious, that does have a value, that is important, and yet isn't yet a separate human being. Theological discussions about the point of personhood have a long history. Traditionally, the position that the church took was that what they called ensoulment, the sense in which the divine spark entered into life, happened at quickening. Does anyone know what quickening means? Yeah. So the point at which a mother first feels the movement of the baby. And that was seen as the sense at which you had a human life. Islamic views are that about 4 months into a pregnancy is the point at which this becomes a human life. Judaism holds that until a baby is born and takes its first breath, that is the point that we can talk about this as a human being. But there's a sense in which that we can kind of talk about all of this and get nowhere, in a sense. We can kind of get very fixated, I think, on trying to say, is there a moment at which this moves from being a non-person to a person? Is there a point we can point to? And I think that that is in some ways the wrong way to look at the situation. And instead, I think that we really need to look at what we do know. And what we do know is what it costs a woman to carry a baby. And we need to take very seriously the fact that for a woman, the process of having a baby is a deeply costly experience in times of physical, emotional, financial, social. It's something that affects life immensely. And a woman carrying a child is not an incubator. I like to talk about the idea that a woman is a co-creator. There's a sense in which through the giving of her body and blood, interesting terminology, isn't it, when we're in a church, the giving of her body and blood, of feeding and nurturing and holding, hormones that are crossing between the two, the more we understand how much what's going on in a woman's life, in her environment, how much that shapes and changes how the baby develops. A woman is a co-creator, and it is an immensely generous gift. So some of the readers that I've been looking at want to focus on that sense of generosity and giving, the sense that this is a bodily, generous gift. And one of them talks about the fact that when you first know you're pregnant, it's a kind of call. So they use the terminology of call. Sorry, C-A-L-L is my English. How would you say it? Call. It's a call. And I think that one of the things that we know and think theologically, that for a call or a call to have an authenticity about it and a generosity about it, there needs to be an assent. There needs to be the right to discern that you can do this and to say yes. Central to our theology of the incarnation is that yes of Mary. That sense that, as I say, she was surprised, but she wasn't forced or coerced. And I think that there's something very interesting about the concept of assent and consent for a woman in giving her body generously in order to co-create a new human life. Of course, many, many women assent in advance. So that was certainly my experience. I wanted to have children, so there's a sense in which I greeted the knowledge that I was pregnant as having already assented to give this consent. But of course, that's not true for everyone, and it has always been the case. We are sexual beings, and that means that sexual relations happen for all sorts of reasons. Consensually, coerced, forced, joyfully, habitually. And the reality is that people fall pregnant at times when they do not intend to. That happens in the past. One of the major areas in which this happened was in faithful marriage, where people would have a real concern about yet another pregnancy. And there's very interesting studies about, if you go back to the kind of earlier 18th century or things, later 18th century, in this country you could buy through mail order abortificants, which were marketed as potions to regularize your menses, was the terminology. And it was accepted, really, that in that early stage of pregnancy, if you found yourself pregnant and you honestly and consciously felt that you could not carry this through, that there ought to be a possibility and a methodology of saying no. It's complex in a sense, and we can kind of look at that because we have to think about, do we suggest then that anybody who says no is somehow being disobedient to a calling? Should they always have to say yes? And that gets us into that very difficult sense of around, which is a whole other complicated issue, which I've spent a lot of time talking about because I've been in student ministry for a long time, about what we mean by consent when we talk about sex, and actually what that means. Can we assume that everybody who had a sexual relationship consented to that? And what would we mean by that? And even if they did they consent to pregnancy? So, and I'm cutting bits out and getting to a place, I hope, where we can talk more. So if I haven't made things clear, push me on it. I think this has moved me to a position where I feel that it can be a morally reasonable decision for a woman in the early stage of pregnancy to say, I cannot do this. I cannot do this because the circumstances of my life, the realities of my life mean that I do not have the capacity to care for this resultant child. Margaret Kamitsuka, whose book is excellent, really good, and I'll write down the title afterwards. She says that most women who make this decision use maternal thinking. So they use the same kind of thinking that they might use over how they would care for any child. So the decision is, can I, in this circumstance, where I am in my life, in this situation, care for this child? And for some people, the answer is no, I can't. And I think that because we believe in freedom and not coercing people, that therefore, and that we have now safe, really, really safe methods of terminating early pregnancies, I feel that that should be a moral decision that we can acknowledge and respond to. Because I think that the idea that women should be, in a sense, coerced or forced into that kind of generosity is problematic. Nobody else can do it for her. Nobody else can step in and say, do you know what, you're finding this hard? I'll do the next 3 months, give it back to you for the last 3 months and see how we go. And we laugh, but that is the reality. The reality is the only person who can generously give for this kind of co-creation is that particular woman in that particular circumstance. And she cannot give it or hand it over to anyone else. I think it's really important when we talk about abortion to talk differently about first trimester abortions and later abortions. That's not that I think necessarily later abortions are wrong, and we might come on and talk about that. I think they raise different issues and different questions. And the reality is that when there is access to safe medical abortion, then that's what most of them are. So in the UK, 89% of abortions that happened in 2021 were within the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. That's what's happening. It's women at the beginning, when they realize that they have been called and asked, can you help create this life? Say, at the moment, no, I can't. And they dissent. And I think that the moral questions, which we might want to talk about more over later pregnancies, later terminations, which tend mostly to either be about serious delay in people having access to abortion. The more we say, actually, you need to delay this, you need to delay this, you need to think about this, you need to think about this, you need to think about this, the more we push it into a more complicated stage of pregnancy, or we have the whole very complex issue about prenatal testing and the issues that we make about there. But I think I think we shouldn't allow our concerns about later abortions to stop us from thinking about these first trimester abortions. These have always been a part of the way women have managed how to have children appropriately that they can care for. And I want to suggest that we should respect women's capacity to make moral choices, not just about their body, but about any emerging life that they might be asked to care for. And allowing terminations at a stage before you've had that sense of feeling, before the relationship started, before it's public, before it has impacted in so many costly ways on your life and your body, is something that we should allow as a morally sensible decision. I'm going to stop there and take questions. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Emma. So if you have a question, I will bring you the microphone. This is part of our Courageous Conversations, where we deal with difficult topics that there are a variety of views on in a respectful manner. So does anyone have a question they'd like to ask?
Thank you, Emma. This is really such a wonderful and rich presentation, very helpful to me. I have found in the last decade or two that my views have started to change on abortion. I did hold at one time to what I take to be a strong feminist view, that abortion is a medical decision, and that the woman alone makes this decision. And I have become uneasy with that view. And I'm beginning to think, well, see what you think about this. I'm beginning to think that perhaps abortion is something that is always wrong but might be necessary. Now, I've heard some people say this about divorce, and I don't know whether to say that, but some people will say divorce is always a tragedy, at least. And I wonder what you would think about a position like that, whether that honors that theme of assent and consent that you bring out so well.
Yeah. I think that if we lived, if we lived in a world where we'd got rid of patriarchy, where women were, had genuine equality, where you were fully and utterly supported, so there was no financial loss to having children, where you were, all of these things, I think there would be fewer abortions, and that would be a good thing. Do I think that all abortions are tragedies? No. I think that for some people it's a good and right decision, and I think to call it a tragedy implies that they must carry actually quite a heavy burden for that. So that's why I'm less happy in that language, because I think for some people it would be the right decision, and to name it a tragedy. But is it tragic in the bigger picture? Yes. So I can have a meta-narrative of tragedy in the same way that I think that there is masses in our world that is tragic, and quite a, I'm a feminist theologian, I'm very shaped by the fact that that there are a lot of problems in our world that are still to do with the inequality of relationships. And I'd love there to be a world in which that wasn't happening. So in the meta-narrative, I'm happy to say it's tragic, because we should always, all sex should be fully consensual, and we should, I don't know. But we've still got the problem, isn't it? That, 50% of those who had abortions in the UK last year were using contraception. And that, I think, I don't know how, and that's in a country where access to free contraception is really easy. So I used to, I worked, as I said, I've worked as a student minister for a long time, and I sit down with the nurse and I'm going, so what are they doing wrong? She go, well, let me tell you, They get drunk, they get sick, they don't realize that messes up the pill, so on. The point is, a lot of people were actively trying not to. So yeah, meta-narrative, tragedy, really concerned about using that on an individual case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Mother Kate. Jim.
Thank you. That all makes perfectly good Anglican sense. and everything you're saying I understand and agree with. Can you help us understand why the Roman Catholic Church, theologically, is opposed to it as an absolute every time, no Anglican, sometimes yes, sometimes no? Okay. What's the theology behind that, and what is their thinking that makes it so absolute for them?
Well, I think one of the things, it's interesting to know, and I do really recommend this book by Margaret Kamatsuka, because she really does go into the history and the theology around the Roman Catholic position and where it's changed. And it has changed. That's really important for us to know. The notion of, for a long time, the Catholic Church held to the idea that life began at quickening. So this notion of conception. One of the things you get in Catholicism is you get consistency and clarity. So if you say that from the moment that the sperm and the egg got together, that is a human being, even if it actually hasn't got all the kind of bodily capacity to be one, then you have a very clear line, don't you? You say there is no sense, no reason why. So if somebody says, what about rape? you say, would someone being raped give them the permission to go and kill their rapist? No, because that's murder. So the Roman Catholic, I mean, one of the glories about Roman Catholicism is that it's always pretty straightforward. And that is very interesting, because one of the problems with a lot of positions around abortion is that we do this mental thing where we say, well, of course, if you've got if I had a 17-year-old girl who'd been raped and she was pregnant, would I make her keep the baby? And a lot of people say no, because they look at that. They can do that in their head. But who judges and where do we judge? And that's my problem. So what's the difference between a 17-year-old girl who was raped and somebody who has been sex trafficked and is working in prostitution and gets pregnant again? Is that a problem too? What happens about the person who is going out with a kind of slightly older guy who they love, and and he says, we're going to have sex now, and she says, we haven't got any protection, and he says, don't you love me? And she kind of says, of course I do, and and then he kind of goes off with her best friend. I mean, where do we judge? Where do we judge? And that's my concern. So I can understand the consistency of the Catholic Church, and in a sense, if I thought conception began, if I thought that was a human being, then I'd have to think differently morally, which is why I find the whole incremental, the notion that this is a developing life. Different.
When did they change?
Sorry?
When did they change from quickening to conception, and why?
I'd have to double check. Do you know, Kate?
I think it was Human APG.
Yeah, so quite recently, really. So that was what, 70s?
1967.
67, yeah. Yeah, which is interesting, isn't it? Because most of us don't know that. In the same way that most of us don't know that in this country you could get mail order pills, One of the really complex things in this country, which I know less about but have been doing some reading on, is of course that was a really complicated racial element here, in that a lot of the midwives were black women. And they were the women who knew what potions to take, what herbs to do, and it was a woman. And you got this real move towards the end of the 19th century and on for white male doctors to take over obs and gynae. And you got this real shutting down of that kind of women-only knowledge. There used to be a whole women-only kind of conversation.
Anybody else?
I guess the thing that I really struggle with is when you said women have to assent to the call. And it is a tremendous gift that you're called to give. But I think back to how we're not supposed to lean on our own understanding. And as a Christian that has faith, for whatever reason, God created this life in you, however it happened. So how are we, what gives us the power to decide that we can't do that? As Christians, we're called to do really hard things all the time and to have faith in the Lord that, kind of like Father Pete's sermon today, that there is a joy coming out of those. We may not be able to see it. There's a million things that we don't know about. So what gives us the power to say, I can't do this, when God may be saying, yes, you can?
And I think that's a really hard question, and I think it's about discernment. And I think that there are, for all of us, there are aspects of our life in which we know that we can't fully follow everything that God calls us to do. I think there is discernment in every call. And I suspect that if you are a person of faith, you may well have different resources to draw on that might enable you to say yes. You're more likely to have a community that might help you do that. Alternatively, you might face total dismissal from your faith community. You might actually be ostracized because you're pregnant in the wrong circumstances. I just think that we need to help. I think every single decision is particular, circumstantial, concrete. And what we need to do is to be more open about the conversations so that when people are making these decisions, they've got people to talk to. Because I think one of the problems at the moment is because we make it such a horrendous decision, people are pushed to do it on their own. And one of the studies shows that women of faith who have abortions, of almost vast proportions of them, never spoken to anybody in their worshipping community. They don't go and talk it through the pastor, they don't go pray, and they don't get the support and the prayer and the love and the help. Have I always answered every call God has given me? I don't know if I have. I've tried. If I was in a situation where I thought that this pregnancy was going to damage the life of the other children I have, or I'd got myself into a situation, it was going to mean I couldn't put food on the table for other people, it would mean I couldn't go and look after my, sick mother. I don't know. Which call would I follow? And that's the difficulty, because we often, Kamitsuko uses a really good American ethicist who has an ethics of care, a wonderful writer called Nell Noddings, who's really, really good. And she says what we have to understand is that we often are faced where our cares conflict. So, I can think of the people who, when I was in pastoral ministry, who spoke to me about possible terminations. One was a situation where a number of children, they just rearranged their whole working life so that the father didn't have to work away, so he could come back and be a father to his boys, and all sorts of things happened, and she suddenly found she was unintentionally pregnant. And she actually did talk to me, and we had a long talk about actually what she was going to do. And she looked into the whole thing. She was a midwife, interestingly. In the end, she chose, they decided they could restructure their life. They could do it. But it was hard on the other kids because their father then worked away again, and, and they didn't have their dad sort of growing up because that was how the finances worked. Other people, it's around, just being very young, about to go to college. Is this will change my life? I think it's difficult, but I think that I think the problem is when we make blanket statements that then have to apply to everybody, because we then don't understand the circumstances. And I think that goes back to Kate's thing, that actually there's an awful lot we could do to be working to try and change our world, that it becomes less likely that people make these decisions. But yeah, I think it's hard. And, and it may be that people, and some people make the decision and think they have done something wrong and it's a tragedy. And some people don't. And I think we need in a church to be honest and open about how we support people in that. And not have it as the secret sin that you can't talk about.
Any other questions? We have about 2 minutes. Yes, Bev.
I sort of have an interesting history with abortion because I was delivered by the founder of Planned Parenthood. And the family joke is after he delivered me, my mother didn't have any more children. But anyway, and he founded Planned Parenthood. But the interesting problem here that we're not talking about is the access to safe abortion.
Yes.
And one of the things, my mother was a nurse at Sinai Hospital in Baltimore in 1943. She worked with Alan Guttmacher, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she was in the office of a urologist. And there were many, many, many women coming into Baltimore at that point to work for the war effort who got pregnant for various reasons. They felt sorry for him, whatever. They raped, it was the night before he left to go off to war, so they got pregnant. And many of them had husbands or boyfriends in the war, so they couldn't tell anyone. And many also simply would lose their jobs, and they couldn't support once they became pregnant, they would not be hired. And in Baltimore at that time, any physician who performed an abortion would be imprisoned for a felony. And so the women were desperate, and there were many, many, many back alley abortions, coat hanger abortions. And even then, the physician was not legally allowed to take care of the women. So they would come to the urologist, and they would be treated for, quote, nicked ureters. And my mother had to participate in this as the assistant to the physician. She personally hated abortion. I think that's a possible stance. But she fought all of her life for the right for these women to have safe medical treatment. And I think there's like a distinction here, and I don't know what you want to say about that, but...
Yes, I mean, you know, you have a very different issue in this country to my experience. You know, in England, the position in England is you need to, as a woman, you need to have 2 doctors agree that it would not be in your best interest in terms of your health and mental well-being to have this pregnancy. And if 2 doctors sign off, you get access to free abortion. If doctors have the right of conscience, so they can say, I can't sign this for you, but they have a legal duty to find you a doctor who will very quickly. So this is why in our country, that's why the numbers are what they are. In a sense, you know, this we're talking about, and most people, 87% of people in the UK in 2021 had what's called a medical abortion, which is they literally take 2 tablets over 3 days and they have a miscarriage. And that's it. And actually, it's safer than giving birth. You know, maternal, I mean, this country has a real problem with maternal death. And, you know, and that's the other thing. I mean, maternal death, long-term health problems. You know, there's one writer who says, if you were medically looking at a pregnant woman and saying, what's the best for her physical health, it would be a termination. But of course, you don't do that because we want to bring a new life. So I think there's but then you have a whole other issue about access to it. And again, it's this notion that so what I keep coming back to, why I think it should always be a particular pastoral. So I tend to say that abortion should be in pastoral theology, not ethics. Because the difficulty is the reasons why people are there and what's going on and how people have got access is always concrete, it's always particular. And I worry that people want to make decisions about an immense cost that a woman has to give on a kind of mega level without having ever spoken to her. My son, who's even more radical than I am, puts it in words I cannot use in this lovely setting. But he says, you know, it seems to me, he said, everybody wants to fight for your life before you're born and then tell you to off when you're born. And that's it, you know, child poverty in both our countries is growing. And these are, they're all, we can't separate, you know, we can't say to women, oh, whatever happens, you've got to have this baby. In a world where, what are we actually doing for that future child? I think that's right. There we go. I'm not right. I've just got to this place, which I'm comfortable with. I continue to read and to think and pray, but I do want to give you absolute credit for coming and listening and talking about this, because I think our churches need to have nuanced conversations about this. Thank you. Bless you.
Thank you very much, Emma. And let us end with a prayer. God of mercy and grace, we thank you for sending Jesus into our messy world. We pray, Lord, that you will comfort our hearts and comfort the hearts of those who are having this struggle. Send us out in peace to love and serve you and our neighbor and ourselves. Amen. Thank you for coming.